Good evening, everybody. Welcome to We Rise. So I'm Mimi Martinez McKay. I'm the Deputy Director for Los Angeles County Mental Health. We're the sponsor of this event, and we couldn't be happier that you're joining us tonight. And tonight is a really meaningful evening, and it definitely is for me, and I think it will be for all of you. In my background, as in many of yours, I have a family member with serious mental illness, my mother, and she was diagnosed at a young age with bipolar, and it was a long journey in terms of her care and her treatment. And when people ask me about this event and why we're focusing on people 14 to 24, and of course everybody that loves them, I think a lot of you realize that that's the age at which serious mental illness tends to first manifest. And if people get the treatment and intervention that they need, that can change the course of their life and all the people who are in their lives. So that's what we're here tonight to talk about. And we have three amazing, powerful women that are going to share their stories, both their personal stories and then the advocacy that they have done on this subject. And those women are Mia St. John, Mädchen Amick, and Mariel Hemingway. So I invite them to the stage to have this conversation, and thank you all for being here.
So hi, I'm Mariel Hemingway, and I know that you're gonna know Mädchen, and you're not gonna know Mia, but you probably don't know me. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about my story so you can figure out why I would be on the stage talking about serious mental illness. My grandfather, Ernest Hemingway, was one of the greatest writers of the 20th century, and probably of many centuries to come. And he was an extraordinary man. I come from an amazing family, but I come from a family that also suffered from serious mental illness. I come from 7 suicides. My grandfather, Ernest Hemingway, committed suicide. His father committed suicide. My grandmother Hadley's father committed suicide. I have a great uncle that committed suicide. I have an uncle that committed suicide, a cousin, and my own sister Margot committed suicide. So I grew up in a family that I loved, but I also was terrified that I would end up like. So my story, I believe that telling our story is a powerful way that we can reach other people, because when you hear that I come from this celebrated family, this famous family, and then you hear that I come from all this suicide, and that I lost a sister, and that my older sister who's still alive is schizophrenic, and that I suffered from depression, and my own grandfather, Ernest Hemingway, who committed suicide, was probably bipolar, but back then they didn't know what that was. He was also an addict. He drank too much, but he was self-medicating the pain that he was in. This event is so extraordinary because we're talking about artists, we're talking about people, we're talking about having conversations. And my grandfather was an artist, my sister was an artist. My oldest sister, who's still alive, is a wonderful artist, but she's schizophrenic. She suffers deeply. I spent a lifetime terrified that I would end up like them, that I would wake up one day and I wouldn't know who I was. So I have spent a great deal of my adult life making people aware that when we tell our stories, we can change people's lives. So I did a documentary called Running from Crazy that Oprah Winfrey produced with me, and it's about my family story and my sisters and addiction and all the different things that happened in my life. But that's my story in a nutshell. I think that it's important to tell our stories because also once you tell your story, it begins the road to recovery. And I just want everybody out here in the audience, in the social media world, to know there is recovery for mental illness. It is not always clean and easy and a straight road. But that's my story, and now I'm going to bring my dear friend, Mädchen Amick, on the stage, and you know her as a wonderful actress who's currently on a show called Riverdale, which is extraordinarily popular. I did a show with her a very unpopular show.
Well, it was a precursor to Sex and the City, thank you very much.
Yes, it was. It was.
Yes,
We
it
just got
was.
on the wrong show. It was called Central Park West, and we had a great time, and it was years and years ago. And I met Mädchen years later, and she came to me after seeing my movie, and she talked about her son. So that'll be my segue to you to
All right.
tell your story,
Passing
a
the
little bit of
baton.
your story.
Yeah. Hi guys, I'm Mädchen Amick, and I've been in film and television for 32 years. The first thing I did was Twin Peaks, and then now fast forward to Riverdale. Because this is what's so important about these conversations that we have with each other. Because Mariel had the bravery to make this documentary, I went and watched it, and I was like, wow, she's being so brave. Little did I know, a year or two later, my son would start showing severe signs of a mental illness, and I'm sitting in the emergency room and my son's being admitted, and I'm lost, and I don't know what to do, and I'm scared, and I was like, I wonder if that email of Mariel still works. I emailed her, and she calls me, and we're sitting there, and we have this long conversation in the emergency room, and she was able to just explain things from a very real, tactical, messy way, and it was so comforting to me. So I want to now pay that forward, and I want, as soon as my son was diagnosed properly and we started finding treatment, there wasn't one moment of being ashamed. My son shouldn't feel ashamed. I'm not ashamed. This is the statistics right now are 1 out of 4 people in their lifetime will be affected by some form of a mood disorder or a serious mental illness. And that's just our statistics right now. And so we're in this together. That's one of our friends, that's one of our coworkers. So I just want to sit here and have an honest conversation with you guys about navigating this path that isn't perfect and it's not mapped out. So I'm super excited about our next panelist.
So, yes.
Yes.
Well, that leads us to our next panelist, and she's a badass. Can we just say? Mia St. John is seriously a badass. I'm like worried if I say the wrong thing, she's gonna punch me up. But Mia St. John has an amazing story, personal story. I mean, it's compelling, it's frightening, it's sad, it's recent. And I would love for you to come out and tell us a bit of your story.
Well, thank you so much. I love you guys, and of course I grew up knowing, Mariel Hemingway. So I'm truly honored to be here on the same stage. I can't even believe it. I thought that I had it made, that I had the best life anyone could ever have. Everything I ever dreamt of, I made happen because my mother told me I could. She said, whatever you think, whatever you dream about, you can become. And so as a kid, I said, okay, I want to be Rocky Balboa.
Nice.
And that was my goal since I was a child. So I started fighting at a very young age. I was 6 years old, and I competed for probably 23 years before I turned pro in boxing. And the only reason I turned pro in boxing was because Don King had made me an offer I could not turn down. And my life just took off from there. Everything I ever wanted. I became a 5-time world champion. And then somewhere in the midst of my career, my precious, beautiful boy, my firstborn son, was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And I just want to tell you briefly how it happened. He was about 17 years old, and I got a call from his best friend. They were at the high school. And he calls me, he says, Mia, I don't know what's happening. Julian's talking very fast, and he's talking very aggressive. Something's wrong. And because I had I had a psych degree because my mother's from Mexico and said, I did not bring you to this country to be uneducated. So I was forced to get a bachelor's, and so I chose psychology. And thankfully, I didn't know how important that would be for me in my life, because when I got this phone call and he told me what my son was doing, I realized this was psychosis and something was terribly wrong. So I called his father and we made a plan to get our son, meet in the parking lot, and we would have him hospitalized. And we did, and he was put on, well, okay, let me back up and tell you what he was saying at the high school. He was planning a shootout. He had bought a gun from someone's uncle for $200, and he was going to have a shootout because he was going to take these people out that were planted there by the government, and that were going to take out his family, but he was going to take them out first and then turn the gun on himself. And that really affects me to this day when I think about it, because I think of all the shooters that we've had, Parkland, Aurora, Arizona. And when my son was finally medicated, diagnosed and medicated, he was mortified when we told him what he had been planning. Because this was not my son. My son was the most gentle, loving soul. My son wanted to help everybody. He was always helping the homeless. He was an amazing artist. So in psychosis, he was a completely different person. The illness had taken over. But my son went on and off his meds, and in the end, he became addicted to meth, and he ended up taking his life in a mental health facility. And I felt like my whole world came crashing down. But little did I know that it was going to get worse. The father of my children, my son who passed away and my daughter who's still living, I married the man of my dreams. The man of my dreams. I saw him one day on a TV show, and I used to watch it every single week. I was like, oh my God, I've got to marry that guy. And oddly enough, one day I met him in an AA meeting. And I thought, I want him, I'm gonna marry him, I'm gonna have his children. I told my best friend this, and she said, well, what are you gonna do? And I said, I'm just gonna walk by him, and I know he's gonna say something. Because that was my mother talking, like, you know, what I think I become. So I walked by him, he said something. Long story short, we ended up getting married, having 2 beautiful kids. We were both addicts. After the passing of our son, my dear ex-husband could not, by then we were divorced. He could not, he was on a show for 30 years called Young and the Restless. And he could not deal with the pain. And he was often running to self-medicate to hide the pain of losing our son. On February 3rd, on February 3rd, I lost the love of my life to bipolar illness and alcoholism. He had a blood point level of 0.35. So I'm here today to talk about serious mental illness because it's a subject that often goes ignored, especially with our young adults. And I have a young adult here that I actually work with at a program called Step Up on Second for the homeless who have mental health issues. And he is my friend, Shane. Shane was homeless, and today he is now housed and he's doing well. And these kids, I call them kids, they're young adults, but they keep me alive every single day. With that, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for having me.
So, you know, for me, having conversations with other like-minded people that come from the same kind of family is so, I mean, it kind of blows my mind, and I'm sure if you've suffered in any way or somebody that you love suffers, you know that it's just a really super painful thing, and it's also very confusing. I want to address what it means when you first discover. What is that moment? What is that moment like when you realize that it's mental illness that's haunting your life? So let me start with you, Mädchen.
My son was a really gifted student athlete. He still holds the record in national long jump, the 100 meter, the 200 meter. You know, a beautiful, bright, kind boy. And he had the world at his fingertips. And he went off to UC Irvine on a track scholarship. And it just so happened one night, coming home from some party, he witnessed a really shocking, horrific suicide. A boy had jumped from a rooftop and landed right in front of him. Not somebody that he knew, but he went to the aid of this young man. That young man, unfortunately, passed away that night, the next morning. And this seems to be the trigger that unlocked his own genetic predisposition to his mental illness. And his sort of, I guess, average college partying started to become more bizarre, more strange. His behavior became odd to his friends. And it wasn't really until 6 months, 8 months later, did the coach reach out to us and say, I wish I would have been able to have talked to you about this earlier, but it's gotten to a point where we need to let you know he's being put on probation and there's a lot of addiction issues that are happening. So we jumped in and we tackled it as a family as if it were addiction. In one of the psych wards that he was admitted into on a 5150, we just thought, you know, he really took something really bad, and it's taking a long time for him to clear. And it was in that time period that they diagnosed, we think he has bipolar disorder. And I remember feeling like somebody had just kicked me in the gut and took my breath away. And it was the scariest thing I had ever heard. And I was like, wait, what? Because I didn't know much about the illness, and that just sounded like a death sentence to my son. And there was a time period of denial. No, there's no way we would have known that. Eventually, that diagnosis has become a gift to us as a family. It sounded really scary at first. But once you really understand the illness, you realize that you can navigate through it and you can live a very prosperous life. And so for supportive loved ones or somebody that might be diagnosed with it, I want you to know, the most important thing I want you to know is there's a path to recovery. It's messy, it's not perfect. You're not gonna navigate it perfectly. Everybody's gonna make mistakes. You're going to have successes and then you're gonna have some setbacks, and that's okay. But it was really, really shocking. And I see why family members or friends, it sounds so scary that you just want to push it away and you want to deny it. And if maybe you're diagnosed, you just want to deny it. That's just too scary. So I don't want to normalize it, but I want it kind of to be normalized. Oh, do you have diabetes? Do you have a heart condition? Do you have high blood pressure? Oh, do you have a mental illness? I mean, it's okay. It's just another organ that's affected, and I want to make it okay for us to all talk about it and navigate it.
I think that's really important because the brain and the body are not separate. That's
right.
So, and that's key. I mean, part of my story about recovery is about knowing that the body, the mind, the spirit are actually working together. That leads me to you, Mia, because when we talk about addiction, because there was so much addiction in my family, and it was interesting, you thought, well, I'm addressing addiction, but that's really not what it was. But addiction often goes hand in hand with mental illness. And with my sister, she did a lot of acid in the late 60s, early 70s, and that triggered predisposition for her schizophrenia. And And I think that we need to have better conversations with the people that are talking to addicts, because that mental illness line and addiction, addiction is a mental illness, but and we have to negotiate that road very carefully. And I think, Mia, you have a very compelling story with both your son and your ex-husband.
And I didn't mention, but some of you may know, after I got the call, Shane was actually with us. When I got the call, I'd sent someone to go check on my ex-husband because I panicked because he had called me at 11 in the morning on Super Bowl Sunday and was just crying and crying and saying he just wanted to die. And I was too far away, so I had someone go break into the house, but it was too late. And Shane remembers this, I don't. All I remember is I started screaming and I just started drinking again. I had 30 years of sobriety at one point. And I was 51-50'd, and then I was let out, and then I was 51-50'd again, and it's all been a blur. But my struggle now is to get back to sobriety, and it's one day at a time, and it's so difficult because I think, the days are such a struggle for me. How did I get 30 years? It's just, when one day seems like a lot, but yeah, and I also was diagnosed with OCD, panic disorder, and generalized anxiety disorder. So I think, like you said, it a lot of times it does go hand in hand.
Well, I think there's this self-medication that happens when you suffer from any kind of thing that you think you can get a handle on by taking something, and I think that that's a misnomer in mental illness. There's not really one thing out there that's going to cure you pill-wise. It's a combination, like you talk about. The road to recovery is a messy, and it's different for everyone. It just, just like we're all individuals, so our stories are different, the way that we're gonna have to address it. What I love about Re-Rise is they're talking about yoga, they're talking about mindfulness stuff, so that we can incorporate all these lifestyle things into our life. I'm not saying that that's a sole solution, but I'm saying that when we deal with mental illness, we have to look at the whole picture. We have to look at
And the whole
everything we're
person
doing.
and
the
how
whole
individual.
person. Absolutely.
For some people, it's nutrition, or it's sleep patterns, or it's different things can be your triggers, and it's different for everybody.
Absolutely.
So you really have to know yourself, and you have to know your loved
Absolutely,
one.
but it's also taking responsibility. I think that we, as a culture, don't want to take responsibility for things. We'd like to find a doctor, say,
Take one pill
you
and it's
screwed
over.
up, or you didn't, and you have to do this, and it's all going to be okay. It's just not that way. Mental illness, and I actually think that with any kind of physical illness as well. We have to take responsibility for our health by knowing about what it is that we are suffering from. For my own depression, I've never been on medication, but I know myself so well, I know what works for me. That's just me. That's my story, that's my journey, and I share that journey for those like-minded people that can get to that sweet spot that way. But not everybody can. It's a combination of many different things. So
there's a video that you did that I watched. You guys have to Google this. It was Profiles of Hope, and how you talk about connecting with nature, and you're doing yoga and you're meditating, and I love that so much, and I encourage you guys to really watch it. It's called Profiles of Hope, and it's with Mariel Hemingway, and I just started telling all my friends about it because I really truly believe that. Like, the only way I was just in New York City, and I was thinking, oh my God, like, I've got to get to some kind of nature, some kind of park or somewhere where I can connect with myself again. So anyway, I just want to tell you, I really love that, and it really inspired me.
Oh, Oh, that's really sweet.
And I think there's something to be said too about like how we figure out how to navigate even within different cultures within our society. My husband is African and Spanish. My kids are mixed, so they have these different backgrounds to pull from. And my husband talks about, you know, that it's really hard for people in the Black community to even wrap their minds around going to a psychiatrist or therapist
Right.
or a doctor.
Very
So
true.
Yes.
for them, their doctor or their therapy is going to the church or going to some community center. And that's okay. I would like there to be all kinds of help for everybody in every neighborhood, but figure out what works for you and figure out what
But there
you're
are
open
there
to.
are solutions within their spiritual communities. It's such
Yeah.
it's such an important point because I speak around the country, and African Americans have a really challenging time being able to talk about it when you
Right.
talk about
And it's
stigma.
deep-seated, you know, it's like-
it
Well,
is
that's
deep-seated.
one
But
of the
what I love that you say, and I want you to talk about stigma versus
Discrimination.
discrimination.
Yes.
Yes.
But it's interesting that you said that because the reason my ex-husband felt so guilty after my son passed was because I'm Latina and my ex-husband was Black. So our cultures do not accept mental illness, and he did not accept it until my son finally passed, and then it dawned on him, and that was the guilt. But what was the question? Oh, discrimination.
Yes.
So yeah, and I.
She was fired up in the back when I think somebody mentioned stigma, and she went, "It's not stigma, it's
Yeah,
discrimination,"
it's
and it's
discrimination.
true.
Yeah, we are truly, people who are mentally ill are discriminated against. And I've always said that, like, if your mother has Alzheimer's and wanders out into the street naked, and you know, everybody like rushes to help the mother who has Alzheimer's and let's get her into a hospital, but if you have schizophrenia and you run out into the street naked, yeah, I mean, it's just, you know, go to Skid Row. Nobody's like, I
My
mean, they're.
sister Muffet, my oldest sister,
I
was
read
when I was 7 years old. My parents put me in the car, and it was January, and I grew up in Idaho, and it was, you know, snowing outside, and I was in the back of the car, and I think it was late, you know, because I was woken up and I was put in the car, and my parents were looking for my sister, and I didn't know that that's what they were doing, and I kind of, in my groggy state, I look out the window and I can see this person walking along the road with a big scarf, completely naked, and it's below zero. It's in January, and it's snowing. And my parents pull over, and they get her into the car, and they send her. They tell me, they send her to college. And college, when we visited her, had bars on the windows, so they sent her to a state hospital. And this was back when. I mean, this was the 60s. People did not talk about mental illness at all. So we have come a far
And I
distance,
feel
but
like
we
they-
have such a distance to go.
They probably felt like they were protecting you.
Oh, totally.
Well, really, they should have just been talking about it.
Totally,
This is
but
what's going
I
on.
didn't know until
Yeah.
I was 16, really. I used to think my sister was so cool because she was bright and she was an amazing artist. She was beautiful, but she was bizarre. She did bizarre things, but I never really knew until she threatened my mother's life once when she was having an episode with a pair of scissors, that I realized, oh, wait a second, this is no joke. This is something, you know, there's something wrong here. And it was so hard for somebody you love doing something like your son planning a shoot, you know, that he's gonna kill people in school because because schizophrenia does things to the brain that we cannot understand, and there's no logic to it. So that's why when we are presented with that kind of terror, really, we have to address it. We have to find help immediately. So I think that's
What if we were
extremely
all, like, imagine if we were all educated in mental illness? Like, I know some states have I think it's Mental Health 101, but if we all knew the signs and symptoms, how many of these tragedies could have been prevented? Because the signs were there. And a lot of these kids were in seeing, you know, a psychiatrist, some of them were on meds. So just imagine, like,
Well,
what could
and
have
I
been
always say
prevented.
too that we have this mandate in our schools that you go and get a the kids go and get a physical checkup every year of everything from the neck down, right? Or
Except the
everything
brain.
from the
Except
eyes
the
down,
brain.
except the brain. So I don't know exactly what that looks like. I know there might be some people who fear like, oh, now all of a sudden everybody will be psychoanalyzed, but there needs to be education and information because now in hindsight, we can look back and we can see a few things that were warning signs along the way, but we didn't know.
Right.
You know, we didn't know. So,
And I think schools are doing, there's wonderful schools around the country that are making a difference and really asking important questions. Because it's an epidemic with teenagers committing suicide and mental illness and bullying and all these different things because of the world we live in now, not the world that I grew up in, but the world we live in now. There's a lot of pressure, and kids are seeing those triggers are happening
more intensely, more often.
and it's probably because we can see them now. You know, we didn't see them before, but there are ways, and I think, you know, that leads me. If there were two questions you would ask somebody, and because I know that you both reach out to people a lot, what are the two things that you would say to your friend when you first meet them and you know that they're struggling? What are the things that you say, or do you just listen? What is kind of what do people do? I think people get afraid, and you said something very interesting in the green room about, you know, go take, you know, instead of just throwing $1 out, ask them how they're doing. You want to have a cup of coffee? I thought, wow, that is, I mean, it gave me chills because I thought, first of all, that's amazing.
Well, because people are so afraid. Like if you walk down Skid Row or, you know, a place that maybe like Venice or where you see a lot of homeless people.
West Hollywood.
Yeah, I mean,
West Hollywood, yeah.
people tend to be afraid, and they just kind of walk past them as if they're invisible. But yeah, I like to stop and say, well, and I did this after my son passed, because after my son passed, it's like I did not even care. Like I had no fear in me. You know, if I was killed, I was whatever. So I went out on a limb and I just started talking to them and inviting them to lunch and just keeping in contact with them every single day.
But I think what you're doing that's truly breaking stigma or whatever you want to call it, because you're coming into their world. You're actually seeing them by saying, hey, you want to get a cup of coffee, or tell me your story. There's people wearing t-shirts that say, tell me your story, talk to me. That's a powerful thing. And it's really important for those of you that don't suffer a mental illness to know that people that do, especially people that have suicidal tendencies, feel very alone and very unheard. You know, they're not listened to, or they don't feel listened to, or a parent kind of listens, or they, you know, or they're just a parent and we just always screw up because we're parents. But the truth is they need to feel heard, and it's about sitting in stillness and silence, and that's what my, you know, mindfulness practice has taught me, is to be able to sit in stillness and listen to somebody without that desire to say something or to fix.
Yeah,
because there is no fixing. You know, there's really.
Are you sure?
Well, there might be some fixing, but I think
I'm
it
really
starts
trying.
with listening.
But, and you know, I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but do you notice that people like with mental illnesses, and I've been diagnosed myself, so I probably include myself in that category, but do you notice that, like, especially like with the homeless, like they don't follow pop culture, so they don't know about the Kardashians or anything like that. So when you talk to them, it's not a conversation about, oh, did you watch such and such, you know, a conversation that I'll have with my girlfriend. Did you watch, my favorite show is 90 Day Fiance, so I could talk about that forever. But you'll notice that the conversations with them are very deep. It's about maybe your purpose in life, the universe, and that's a gift. Because how often do you get that conversation?
I mean, my sister, who's schizophrenic, whenever I see her, it's always the most, it used to make me uncomfortable because I knew she was, you know, like not well or something. But now I really look forward to the fact that she's so pure and these conversations are so, but they're deep. They're very, very deep.
Yeah, very deep.
I'm gonna wrap up kind of our conversation amongst ourselves, and I wanna throw it out to our audience, because I would love for you to ask questions, so we can have a dialogue with you. So, yes, I see a hand.
How did you have these conversations? Because once your child is an adult, you can't force them. Like when he was in middle school, I took him to a therapist because he was, covering his face up with his hoodie and not talking to anybody. But now I can't do that.
It's still a work in progress with me and my son. I want him to go to more regular therapy and to find whatever that means for him, whatever version of that. And he goes through waves. He does go sometimes. I nudged him to going to see my therapist, like, you'll really like her, and then he did not like it at all. Of course, probably because he was my therapist. But I think it's just continuing to encourage him to figure out what works for him. Maybe he's finding his own version of what he needs. Maybe he knows that surfing is a huge part of his own self-therapy. And I think maybe it's hard as parents because I feel like they purposely don't listen to you and they purposely, I think hopefully he'll find what works for him, and maybe in very gentle ways, ooh, I heard about this thing or that thing. But to be totally blunt and honest, it's still a work in progress for me. And my son makes great strides, and then he backtracks, and he makes great strides. And me as a mother supporting, I sometimes say the best things that really help, and then sometimes I say the wrong things. And that's okay, because my intention is to help, and I think his intention is to find recovery however it happens.
Can I address this, even though I don't have a child? I have two daughters.
Daughters.
I don't have one who is suffering that way, but I have watched a lot of it. I would say, just like she said, he knows something deep down inside in him that works for him. And I'm not saying that's the sole solution, surfing or whatever, or yoga or all of that. But I would say that his road to recovery is through that pathway. And that at some point, he might find somebody on that road that is the perfect person to talk to. Because that's how I found, the right person to talk to, and I didn't realize it was therapy, but in the end, maybe it was. So I think it's just different for everybody. And I think that, we have to honor their knowing of themselves. But it is hard, because we just get scared because it doesn't look like it's supposed to look like, but you should be going to therapy,
And if he went that one time, that therapist may not have been right, obviously, right? But maybe if he continues to go and try different people, you might finally find a good fit. So it's just keeping an open mind and hoping that
Teachers can sometimes be incredible ways for kids, young people to really understand more about themselves, Yes. Here?
All right, thanks so much for opening up. And I think, so I'm a psychiatrist at LA County Hospital, and I think we don't get to hear this side of the story a lot of the time when we deal with the acuity and seeing the patients. So I think one thing that would be really helpful to hear from your perspective is, as a provider, what can we do better in those first stages? When you're in the emergency room with your son, not really knowing what to do, what are some things that we can do to kind of alleviate the stress and the distress, and better ways of communicating with families and with loved ones that are in those situations?
Well, first of all, thank you for what you do. Honestly, it's the people in those hospitals, it's the nurses, it's the social workers that helped us as a family more than anybody, more than the psychiatrists. So thank you.
Where did you say that you worked? I'm sorry.
LA County Hospital, USC.
Oh,
You are a
okay,
psychiatrist
okay.
though, yes? Yes.
Oh, okay. So
You're right, they are the ones.
I have a suggestion. My son was in and out of LA County facilities. And what I noticed, and I was 5150 myself, and then my ex-husband was in Los Encinas, 5150. What I noticed is, because with my son, the facility was found guilty of neglect and falsifying records. And they had had a long history of deaths and falsifying records and neglect. And I found that it wasn't just that facility, but through my own research, I found that many facilities in LA County had been found neglectful and in violation. And what I noticed was just I don't know if it's being understaffed or sometimes the staff become apathetic. You know, it's a very difficult job. But I would say a suggestion is to don't dehumanize them. You know, like really try to get to know them and let them know that you do care, you know. Because that's what I found, I think, was most missing in these facilities, even the one that I was in.
I wonder though, this is a question. I feel like people who initially go into that field of work are going in because their heart is telling them to go in. And then it's maybe something that's happening within that system that beats them down, that makes it hard for them to survive themselves, and it becomes sort of like a survival themselves. So I'm just asking that question, like what can we do? What do we do?
I think the system
how do we
is
help them?
definitely broken because the system is also attached to the judicial system. There is a wonderful judge in Dade County, Florida, in Miami, and he has turned the kind of mental health program around only in that city, and it's extraordinary because they had the same similar there was neglect and it was a tough situation because it's a tough job, but he started educating police officers on what the signs were so that these people that were suffering from serious mental illness, they were not criminals, you know. And they were ending up in jail, or they were ending up, you know, in holding facilities and this kind of thing. So he has really turned that system around and he's creating a building where, you know, the seriously mentally ill will get to go to. And he's starting to educate people around the country, and I'm hoping California becomes one of those states where the police officers will get trained and stuff like that, because oftentimes what happens is something like that, you know, something serious happens, and then, you know, police are called, and then it gets into the wrong hands with the wrong people instead of you who can actually talk to somebody and ask questions. I think that, you know, for me, you know, speaking to you, I would say, again, it's that, you know, not dehumanizing them and listening to them in a way that makes it feel authentically caring, you know? And I think that's hard when you deal with a lot of people during the day, and sometimes they're not happy. They're angry, and they're not easy to deal with, you know? So serious mental illness is serious.
And I think we need to figure out a way how to support the ones who are supporting our loved ones.
Yeah.
Right, and I don't know exactly how to fight for that. I'll just share a really quick story because I want to hear more of your questions, but my son at one point had been kicked out of sober livings and different treatment centers because the quote-unquote dual diagnosis sober living or sober treatment center had no idea what mania looked like, and so to them it looked like he was seeking to use this and that. So he ended up on the streets. He tried to check himself into homeless shelters, turned away because they were full. Eventually turned himself in to an emergency room in Pasadena. It was supposed to be a really great hospital, and they turned him away saying that he was just bed seeking. Thank goodness he wasn't suicidal that night because he was turned away. This is somebody that actually went for help and was turned away because they don't have enough beds or they're accused of manipulating the system. I just wanted to share that because that needs to change. We got to figure it out. We have to change it.
Well, I think what's really powerful about both of you is that you are people that support people that have been through the tough times. And that's, you know, sometimes we get forgotten, the ones that are left behind. You know, somebody takes their life and then you're left holding the bag of emotions and pain. And so to all of those of you that support somebody who's suffering from serious mental illness, we love you. We know it's hard.
And you know what? I think an important thing to add to is if you do have a loved one that you think is suffering, or you know is suffering, educate yourself. Education.
Yes, it made
So my
a
mom
huge
used to say,
difference.
yes,
Yeah.
educación.
When you know the science of the brain and what's going on. it's
Yes,
really
because
amazing.
how many people, I'm really curious, I know you were all here and know something about mental illness, or you wouldn't be here, but how many people can know the symptoms of psychosis?
Raise your hand.
And probably, yeah, a lot of you, because you're here. But
Maybe half.
the lay person, like, how many of them can say, if you ask them what is schizophrenia, what would they say? Do you
that
really
person on the
know? Do you really know? Like, we usually just think that guy's an asshole. You know, right? And you don't know, because I know there were plenty of times my son was an asshole, you know? But I didn't realize, like, many times that, you know, he was hearing voices, so he was very pissed off. But so you don't know, and so to me it's so important to be educated. And there's actually, I went to, it's NAMI.org. How many of you know NAMI? Yeah, they have like a 6-week
Yes.
free course, and you learn
Yes.
about every single mental illness there is.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
if you're
It's
somebody
very,
who's
very
supporting
helpful for
someone,
families.
that's great.
Well,
Okay,
we have
wait,
come
we have another question.
Okay, I've been told we were
I'm
coming to the end.
so sorry, but I have to be the serotonin in the room and bring some happiness here. My name is Sofia Gonzalez. I'm a public health practitioner. I focus on public health nutrition, and this Saturday marks 14 years since I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, bipolar type 1, and I am currently, and I'm happy to say this, on my way to recovery. I am treating my imbalance because I don't want to use disorder or illness. I am treating my imbalance through Ayurveda, or as they say in the West, Ayurveda. And it's the sister science of yoga. And I'm treating my imbalance through nutrition. Because if you really think about it, nutrition starts in the gut. So I would suggest to start doing research on the gut-brain connection, because it starts from the stomach to the heart to the brain for a powerful start. Thank you.
Yes, we have somebody up here at the front.
Mia, I want to thank you all very much for standing naked in your truth. Mia, I just want to say that I met, at the pleasure of meeting you and Christoph at Department of Mental Health Commission meeting a couple of years ago when you were advocating for your son. We're actually Facebook friends, but I want to say that, you know, I was very, I'm just very disheartened to hear of his loss, and I just want to put that out there that I'm sorry for your loss, you and your family's loss. It's actually a loss to all of us here. But and I also just want to say that as a Skid Row resident, I write, talk, and I advocate Skid Row from a woman's perspective. I was displaced there just over 6 years ago myself. And the fact that I met you at the Mental Health Commission meeting, you know, something was said a little while ago, like, what can we do? And the advocating is extremely important. And really, like you were saying earlier, holding people accountable struggle. I think one of the things that we need to advocate is the fact that Department of Mental Health Commission, mainly have people sitting on the commission board who look and nothing like who we are as people in the community living with the diagnosis. And so this is something that we have to advocate, that there are more people with lived experience and that there are more people from our communities who are actually studying and doing the work, have the laid work experience. And this is how we have to then hold people accountable, because it's simply the fact of Black women are the #1 demographic living in poverty to homelessness. We haven't talked about intergenerational trauma. I was at a domestic violence meeting today. You know, we haven't talked about all the different ills of violence and trauma that are affecting and displacing a lot of women actually to the streets. And then people end up self-medicating because what the hell are you gonna do? You gotta find some way when you're going through this monkey game of a system. So I would love to really see a Black woman on the stage with all of you next time, and I would love to see us talking about from Skid Row from a woman's perspective. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. I think we have wrapped this up, and you're awesome.
I could stay here all night and talk to you guys.